The opening assembly at Northbridge Academy was always a stuffy, predictable affair. You had your usual welcome back speech from the principal, a rundown of the new school year's rules that nobody would remember by lunch, and the obligatory rah-rah cheer for the football team. It was a tradition as old and dusty as the velvet curtains on the auditorium stage, but this year was different. You could feel it in the air. It was thick and heavy, like the silence before a thunderstorm. I was a sophomore then, 16 years old, and my primary goal in life was to be invisible. Leo Carter, just another face in the crowd. I was tall and lanky, with a habit of slouching to take up less space. I kept my hair long enough to hide behind, and my answers in class short enough to avoid follow-up questions. For me, a successful school day was one where I made it from first bell to last without anyone really noticing I was there. So when the atmosphere in that auditorium started to feel like a high-tension wire, every nerve in my body screamed, "Abort." Dr. Meredith Thompson, our principal, stepped up to the podium. She wasn't your warm, fuzzy type of educator. She was a woman carved from granite, with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through your excuses and a voice that could cut glass. The microphone whined for a second as she adjusted it, a sound that grated on everyone's already frayed nerves. The entire student body, a sea of navy blue blazers and plaid skirts, fell silent. "Good morning, students," she began, her voice crisp and devoid of any warmth. It echoed slightly in the vast, hushed hall. "Welcome to a new academic year at Northbridge. This year, we are embarking on a new initiative, a program designed to foster empathy, resilience, and a deeper understanding of perspective." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. I exchanged a confused glance with Seth, my friend who was slouched in the seat next to me. He just shrugged, his expression as clueless as mine. Empathy programs sounded like some boring new curriculum they were going to force on us. Maybe extra reading or group therapy sessions. I could handle that. I could be invisible in a group therapy session. Dr. Thompson let the murmuring die down, her gaze sweeping across our faces. She seemed to be waiting, letting the anticipation build. This initiative is centered on a core belief that you cannot truly understand a person until you have walked a mile in their shoes. She paused, a master of dramatic timing. Or, in this case, in their uniform. My stomach tightened. What did that even mean? "Effective immediately," she declared, and her voice rose, sharp and unyielding. "The student dress code has been amended. The uniform for all female students will remain the same." A wave of relief washed over the girls' side of the auditorium. "However," she continued, and the word hung in the air like a guillotine, "starting today, all male students will adopt a new official uniform." She took another deliberate pause. The silence was absolute now. You could hear someone's nervous breathing 2 rows back. My own heart was starting to thud against my ribs like a trapped bird. "The new uniform for all boys will consist of the following items: a short, navy blue pleated skirt, a pair of bright pink tights, and black Mary Jane shoes." For a full 3 seconds, nobody moved. It was as if our brains collectively refused to process the words. Skirt pink tights. Mary Jane's. It had to be a joke. A really weird, unfunny joke. Then the explosion. The entire male half of the student body erupted. It wasn't just talking, it was a roar of disbelief, of outrage, of panicked laughter. Guys were jumping to their feet, yelling, "No way, and you've gotta be kidding me!" Seth was staring at me, his mouth hanging open, his eyes wide with horror. I felt like I was going to be sick. My carefully constructed wall of invisibility was about to be bulldozed. Dr. Thompson didn't flinch. She stood at the podium, her expression unchanged, and waited for the chaos to subside. It didn't. If anything, it got louder. That's when Kevin McLaren, a senior and the quarterback of the football team, stood on his chair. "This is insane," he bellowed. "You can't do this. It's humiliating." A chorus of agreement rose up around him. A few of his teammates stood up too, their faces red with anger. They started to move toward the aisle. A small mob of defiance. Compliance with the new dress code is not optional. Dr. Thompson's voice boomed over the speakers, drowning out the noise. It is mandatory. She gestured to the sides of the auditorium, and that's when we saw them. School security guards, more than I'd ever seen at an assembly before, were positioned along the walls. They began to move in, their faces grim. Any student who refuses to comply will face immediate suspension, she stated, her voice as cold as ice. A second refusal will result in expulsion from Northbridge Academy. There will be no exceptions. The security guards reached Kevin's group. There was a brief, ugly scuffle. We watched, stunned, as our school's star athletes were physically escorted, pushed back down into their seats. The message was brutally clear. There was no room for argument. The protest died as quickly as it had begun, replaced by a thick, suffocating dread. The air didn't just feel like a storm was coming anymore. It felt like we were being put into a straitjacket. This wasn't a school assembly, it was a forced re-education. The rest of the assembly was a blur. Dr. Thompson explained the logistics. The new uniforms were already packaged and waiting for us. We were to collect them by homeroom. We were expected to be wearing them tomorrow. Tomorrow? I felt my throat close up. As we were dismissed, the mood was funereal. No one was talking. The silence was heavier than the shouting had been. We shuffled out, a defeated army, and were herded toward tables where neatly folded piles of our new reality waited. Each pile was in a clear plastic bag, topped with a piece of paper. I took my bag, the plastic crinkling in my trembling hand. Inside, I could see the dark navy fabric of the skirt, and, coiled like a venomous snake, the shockingly bright pink of the tights. The black shoes were in a separate box at the bottom. My name, Leo Carter, was on the label. This was real. My eyes fell to the sheet of paper on top. It had diagrams, instructions on how to properly wear the uniform, care instructions for the tights. It was absurdly practical, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. But at the very bottom of the page, underneath all the typed instructions, was a single sentence. It was written in a flowing, elegant cursive, like a personal note. It looked like Dr. Thompson's handwriting. It read, "Walking a mile in someone else's skin might save your life one day." I stared at the words, a cold shiver tracing its way down my spine. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a prank. It was a threat, a promise, a riddle I had no idea. But as I looked around at the hundreds of other boys clutching the same bizarre package, their faces a mixture of fear and fury, I knew one thing for sure. My life of invisibility was officially over. Getting home felt like a walk to the gallows. I clutched the plastic bag against my chest, as if I could somehow hide it from the world, even though I was already in the privacy of my own neighborhood. The familiar streets looked alien, and I felt like a spy carrying a dangerous secret. When I finally made it to my room and locked the door, my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a trapped drum solo of pure panic. I dropped the bag on my bed. It landed with a soft, dull thud. For a long time, I just stared at it. The navy skirt, the obscene pink tights, the glossy black shoes. It looked like a costume for a play I never wanted to be in. A part of me wanted to just shove it in the back of my closet, bury it under old hoodies and forgotten sneakers, and pretend it didn't exist. But Dr. Thompson's words echoed in my head. Suspension. Expulsion. My parents would kill me. There was no escape. With a deep, shaky breath, I tore open the plastic. The first thing I touched was the skirt. The fabric was a heavy, starchy polyester. It felt coarse and unnatural under my fingertips. I held it up. It was shockingly short. A simple kilt-like thing with sharp pleats. It seemed impossibly small. Something for a child, not a 16-year-old guy. Next, I took out the tights. They were sealed in their own little cardboard package. The color was even more aggressive up close. A loud bubblegum, "Look at me pink." I ripped open the package and the tights spilled out. A slinky, nylon puddle. They felt cool and strangely slippery to the touch. The thought of pulling this synthetic second skin over my hairy legs made a wave of nausea roll through my stomach. Finally, the shoes. They were in a plain black box. I lifted the lid. The smell of cheap leather and glue hit me. Mary Jane's. I'd never even seen a pair up close before. They were clunky, with a rounded toe and a single thin strap that buckled over the top. The sole was hard plastic, and there was a slight half-inch heel that looked both stupid and treacherous. My own reflection in the closet mirror looked back at me, pale and wide-eyed. "You have to do this, man. Just get it over with." I stripped off my jeans and t-shirt, standing there in my boxers, feeling exposed and vulnerable even in my own room. I started with the tights. It felt like the worst part, the most intimate violation. I sat on the edge of my bed and bunched one leg of the tights up, just like I'd seen my mom do with her pantyhose once. The material was cool as I slipped my toes in. The sensation was immediate and bizarre. It was a smooth, constricting coolness that slid up my foot and ankle. I stood up to pull them on, and the process was a clumsy, awkward struggle. The fabric snagged on a dry patch of skin on my heel. I had to hop around, yanking and pulling, feeling utterly ridiculous. As the pink nylon slid up my calf, a shiver I couldn't control ran through me. It was the feeling of slip. It wasn't like pulling on socks or sweatpants. The material glided over my skin, encasing it. It felt alien. When I finally got them pulled up to my thighs, the compression was the weirdest part. It was a snug, constant pressure that made my legs feel like they weren't entirely my own. They felt sculpted, defined, and terribly, terribly pink. I secured the thick waistband around here, my hips. It felt tight and unforgiving. Next was the skirt. I stepped into it and pulled it up. It settled around my waist, and I fumbled with the button and zipper on the side. They were designed the opposite way from my jeans, and my fingers felt thick and clumsy. When I finally fastened the last button, I stood still. The weight of the skirt was unfamiliar. It wasn't heavy, but it was present. I took a hesitant step, and the pleats swayed, brushing against the back of my newly pink thighs. A draft from my open window slipped under the hem, and the cool air on the sensitive skin of my inner thigh was a sensation I had never, ever experienced. It was a tiny, tingling shock that made me freeze. I was so open. Last were the shoes. I sat back down and slipped them on. They were stiff and pinched my feet. I buckled the thin straps, the small metal buckle feeling delicate and strange. I stood up. The slight heel pitched my weight forward, forcing me to stand up straighter. My posture changed instantly, from my usual slouch to a more rigid, balanced stance. I took a step. Clack. The hard sole made a sharp, definitive sound on my wooden floor, a sound my sneakers had never made. I took another step. Clack. The skirt swayed in time with my movement, a gentle swish-swish of fabric. It felt like it had a life of its own, a little satellite orbiting my hips. Finally, I forced myself to look in the mirror, and my breath caught in my throat. It was like looking at a funhouse distortion of myself, a cruel caricature. My top half was still just me, my bony shoulders, my shaggy brown hair, but from the waist down, I was a stranger, a freak. The person in the mirror was a bizarre hybrid, a glitch in the matrix. My legs, those two gangly things I'd never given a second thought to, were now the unavoidable centerpiece of my entire existence. They were encased in the most aggressively cheerful pink imaginable. The skirt cut off high on my thighs, making my legs look impossibly long and exposed. The clunky Mary Janes made my feet look delicate and out of place. A hot, deep blush crept up my neck and flooded my face. My throat felt tight, like I couldn't swallow. This wasn't just clothing. It felt like a public shaming, gift-wrapped and handed to me. The initial shock began to curdle into a sick, churning panic. I was going to have to walk out of my house like this, walk to school, sit in class. People would stare, they would laugh, They would point. Kevin McLaren and his friends would have a field day. I felt a desperate urge to rip it all off, to tear the pink tights to shreds and burn the skirt. But beneath the tidal wave of humiliation and fear, there was another feeling. It was tiny, a flicker in the roaring fire of my panic. But it was there. It was a strange, unsettling curiosity. It was the feeling of the smooth tights against my skin, the way the skirt moved when I turned, the subtle shift in my balance from the shoes. It was a completely new set of physical sensations, a new awareness of my own body that I'd never had before. And as much as I hated it, as much as it terrified me, a microscopic part of my brain whispered, "This is different." It was a thought I immediately crushed, burying it under another layer of pure, unadulterated horror. The walk to school the next morning was the longest walk of my life. Every step was a new exercise in agony. I felt like I was walking naked through a crowd, except it was worse, because the uniform was designed to draw the eye. It was a spotlight, and I was pinned in its beam. The bright pink of my tights seemed to glow with nuclear intensity against the grey morning pavement. I tried to walk normally, but I couldn't. The stiff Mary Janes forced me into a shorter, more deliberate stride. Clack, 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 went my shoes on the sidewalk, announcing my approach. The skirt swished around my thighs with every step, a constant, rustling reminder of my predicament. A light breeze kicked up, and I felt that same terrifyingly vulnerable sensation of cool air where my jeans should have been. I instinctively tried to hold the skirt down, my hand clamping onto the navy polyester. The world seemed to have changed overnight. Every car that drove by felt like it was slowing down to stare. I saw an old woman watering her garden, and her eyes widened as I passed. I could feel her gaze on my back long after I'd turned the corner. My face was burning, a permanent, painful blush that I was sure was as bright as my tights. As I got closer to Northbridge, I saw others, other boys, walking alone or in miserable, silent pairs. We were an army of shame, all clad in the same ridiculous costume. Some guys were trying to hide, pulling their hoodies down low, yanking the hems of their skirts as if they could magically make them longer. I saw one freshman, a small, terrified-looking kid, who was openly crying as he walked. A few had attempted rebellion. I saw a couple of guys wearing basketball shorts underneath their skirts, a desperate attempt to reclaim some shred of masculinity. It didn't work. The shorts just bunched up awkwardly, making the skirt bulge out in weird places, before they even got to the school gate. Mr. Henderson, the gym teacher, was there waiting. McLaren Peterson. "Take the shorts off or go home," he barked, his voice carrying across the street. Kevin McLaren, yesterday's ringleader, glared, but sullenly reached under his skirt and pulled out the offending shorts. The message was clear. There was no cheating the system. Inside the school gates, it was a circus of misery. The hallways, usually buzzing with energy and chatter, were strangely quiet. It was the quiet of 1,000 people holding their breath. Every single eye from the girls, the teachers, the other boys was on us. Specifically, on our legs. The girls weren't pointing and laughing, not most of them anyway. Their expressions were a mixture of pity, morbid curiosity, and complete and utter disbelief. I kept my head down, my gaze fixed on my clunky black shoes, and tried to navigate the sea of bodies to get to my locker. I could hear whispers, stifled giggles. It felt like walking on hot coals. I just needed to get my books and disappear into a classroom. "Hey, Carter." The voice cut through my bubble of self-pity. I froze. I knew that voice. It was Chloe Arden. Chloe was in my history and English classes. She wasn't the most popular girl in school, but she was different. She had this quiet confidence, dark, observant eyes, and a way of saying things that made you actually think. She was smart, a little bit sarcastic, and I'd had a massive, silent crush on her since freshman year. A crush I had, of course, done absolutely nothing about because talking to her seemed about as feasible as climbing Mount Everest in flip-flops. And now, here she was, talking to me. On the day I was dressed like this, it was a nightmare, a literal, honest-to-God nightmare. I slowly lifted my head. She was standing right in front of me, leaning against the lockers. She wasn't smiling or smirking. Her expression was neutral, her head tilted slightly as she looked at me. Not just at my face, but at the whole ridiculous ensemble. I braced myself for the joke, the sarcastic comment, the pitying laugh. But it never came. She just looked at me for a second longer, her dark eyes thoughtful. Then she said so quietly that only I could hear, "You know, pink actually suits you." I just stared at her, my brain short-circuiting. I was sure I had heard her wrong. What I mumbled. "The color," she clarified, a tiny, almost imperceptible smile touching the corner of her lips. "It makes your eyes stand out. They're kind of a hazel green." Right? It's a good contrast. I was completely, utterly speechless. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mouth probably hanging open. Of all the things I had expected someone to say to me today, a genuine, analytical compliment about color theory was not one of them. She wasn't making fun of me, she was just observing, stating a fact as she saw it. My heart, which had been trying to beat its way out of my chest all morning, suddenly felt like it was swelling. The suffocating tightness in my throat eased just a little. It was just one small sentence, a handful of words, but it felt like a life raft in an ocean of humiliation. It didn't make the skirt any less short or the tights any less pink, but it made me feel like I was still visible underneath them, that Leo Carter still existed, separate from this absurd uniform. Thanks. I managed to choke out. It was probably the lamest response in human history, but it was all I had. Chloe nodded, pushing herself off the lockers. "See you in history." Leo. And just like that, she walked away, disappearing into the crowded hallway. I stood there for a moment longer, watching her go. The whispers and stares around me hadn't stopped. The feeling of being a freak on display hadn't vanished. But it had lessened. Chloe Arden had seen me. And she hadn't laughed, for the first time all day. I felt like I could actually breathe. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A week passed, a strange, surreal week. The initial shockwave of the uniform policy had subsided, replaced by a sullen, grinding acceptance. It was the new normal, as bizarre as that seemed. The school hallways became a sea of swishing navy skirts and flashing pink legs, but something else was happening, something subtle that I don't think any of us noticed at first. We were changing. It started with how we moved. You can't stomp around in hard-soled Mary Janes and a short skirt the way you do in sneakers and jeans. We were all walking differently. Our steps were shorter, lighter. You had to be more conscious of your posture to keep your balance in the slightly heeled shoes. There was less slouching in the hallways. We were also forced to be more aware of our surroundings. You couldn't just throw yourself into a chair. You had to sit carefully, making sure your skirt didn't fly up. You learned to keep your knees together. Small, unconscious adjustments that, over the course of a week, began to feel less alien. The tights were another thing. They made you hyper-aware of the air. A cool breeze wasn't just something you felt on your face anymore. It was a sensation that ghosted over your entire lower body. You could feel the temperature change between a sunny spot on the quad and the shade under a tree in a way you never could through denim. It was a constant, low-level sensory input that connected you to your body and your environment in a new way. It was this constant body awareness that was the strangest part. I was perpetually conscious of my legs, how they looked, how they felt, how they moved. A small traitorous part of me was starting to, not like it, exactly, but appreciate the control it required. There was a strange sort of grace in moving carefully, in being deliberate. It was the polar opposite of my usual clumsy, invisible shuffle. I felt more present in my own skin, even if that skin was covered in pink nylon. The first real test of this new awareness came on a Tuesday afternoon. In Mr. Mrs. Davison's American history class, he was droning on about the Industrial Revolution, and the air in the classroom was warm and sleepy. I was trying to focus, but my mind was drifting. I shifted in my hard plastic chair, and the pen I'd been fiddling with slipped from my fingers, clattering to the floor. Automatically, I bent down to get it. It had rolled just under my desk. As I leaned over, my body twisted, and I felt a sudden, weightless flutter. The skirt, the pleats had fanned out, swinging up and away from my legs. A jolt of pure, cold panic shot through me. I froze, halfway to the floor, my face instantly hot. I could feel the open air on my thighs, my boxer-clad rear end almost certainly exposed to anyone behind me. Just then, I felt a light touch on my shoulder. "Careful, Leo!" It was Chloe's voice, a low whisper right next to my ear. She sat at the desk beside me. I hadn't even realized she was paying attention. Her voice was closer than it needed to be, warm and intimate in the quiet classroom. "The skirt," she added, her voice dropping even lower. "It flies up really easily." I straightened up so fast I nearly hit my head on the underside of the desk. My face was on fire. I couldn't look at her. I just stared straight ahead at the blackboard, my heart pounding a frantic tattoo against my ribs. I felt mortified, exposed, and utterly humiliated. But then, underneath the shame, something else flickered, a strange, unfamiliar spark. It was the feeling of her hand on my shoulder, the warmth of her breath near my ear, the conspiratorial nature of her whisper. It was a moment of intense, shared intimacy, born out of my own embarrassment. My entire body was tingling, a weird mix of adrenaline and something I couldn't quite name. It was like the shame and the thrill were tangled up together, creating a brand new, confusing emotion. I risked a sideways glance. Chloe was already looking back at her notebook, as if nothing had happened. But I saw the faint hint of a smile on her lips. She hadn't been mocking me. It felt more like she was letting me in on a secret. A secret about a world I was now, unwillingly, a part of. A world of wardrobe malfunctions and careful movements. I spent the rest of the class in a daze. I didn't hear a single word Mr. Davison said. My mind was replaying the moment over and over. The dropped pen, the swoosh of the skirt, her touch, her voice. The heat in my ears was slowly subsiding, but the strange, electric feeling remained. It was the first time that the uniform, this symbol of my humiliation, had led to something other than shame. It had created a connection, a brief, charged moment with the one person whose opinion I cared about most, and I had no idea what to do with that feeling. The first couple of weeks were about individual survival. Each of us was trapped in his own private bubble of misery. But you can't keep 1,000 teenage boys isolated for long. Slowly, tentatively, we started talking about it. Not in public, not at first, but in quieter moments in the locker room before gym. At a secluded table in the back of the cafeteria, a new kind of conversation began. It turned out I wasn't the only one experiencing the world differently. Seth, who was on the track team, was the first one to say something really positive. "You know," he admitted one afternoon while we were changing for practice, "it's actually not bad for running. The skirt. I mean, it's breezy." He said the last word like it was a dirty secret, way less restrictive than shorts. Nate, a lanky guy from the basketball team, chimed in from across the bench. "The tights are better than I thought." "Too," he said, pulling the pink nylon up his athletic legs. "I took a spill in practice yesterday, slid on the court. Usually, I'd have a nasty floor burn. Barely a scratch this time. They're like, weirdly durable." It was a revelation. We started comparing notes. Mike, who was into fashion and always trying to look cool, had discovered that if he paired the uniform with his favorite leather jacket, it created a kind of punk rock look he actually didn't mind. "It's all about how you own it," he declared, striking a pose. "You gotta make it your own." A strange sort of camaraderie began to form. Born from our shared predicament, we called ourselves the Pleated Skirt Alliance as a joke, but there was truth in it. We were a brotherhood of the bizarre, sir. We were all in this together, and that made it bearable. It was no longer just Leo Carter, the freak in a skirt. It was all of us. The alliance brought with it a new kind of intimacy I'd never experienced with other guys. We became hyper-aware of each other's appearances, not in a judgmental way, but in a supportive one. "Hey, man, your back pleat is tucked in," Seth would say, reaching over to fix my skirt without a hint of awkwardness. "Nate, you've got a run starting in your tights," Mike would point out, and Nate would curse and try to stop it with a dab of clear nail polish someone had produced. We learned to tie the fussy little buckles on our Mary Janes for each other, to help smooth out a wrinkled skirt, to check that everything was in place before heading out of the locker room. These were small acts of grooming, of mutual care, that would have been unthinkable just a month ago. We would have hurled insults at each other for even suggesting such a thing. But now, it felt natural. It was a quiet, practical form of support. There was a weird warmth in it, a sense of shared vulnerability that stripped away a lot of the usual macho posturing. We were all exposed, literally and figuratively, so we had no choice but to rely on each other. For me, this new dynamic was transformative. I had always been on the fringes, the quiet observer. But now, I was part of something. I had a place. The alliance gave me a shield. The stares and whispers in the hallway didn't sting as much when I was walking with Seth and Mike. Kevin McLaren and his crew still shot us dirty looks, but they seemed less intimidating when we were a group. And I had to admit, there was a part of me that was starting to appreciate the aesthetics of it all. It was a strange thought to have, but I couldn't deny it. I noticed the way the uniform looked different on different people. On Seth, an athlete, it looked surprisingly functional. On Mike, it looked intentionally stylish. I started noticing the details, the way the pleats had to be perfectly aligned, the smooth, unbroken line of a new pair of tights. It was a different visual language, a different set of rules, and I was starting to understand it. One afternoon, sitting on the bleachers after school, Mike was complaining about a loose thread on his skirt's hem. Without thinking, I said, "You should use a bit of clear tape on the inside. It'll hold it until you can get it fixed." Both Mike and Seth stared at me. "What?" I said, feeling my face get hot. "My mom's a seamstress. I picked some stuff up." Mike's face broke into a grin. "Dude, that's brilliant." He looked at my own perfectly aligned skirt and smooth tights. "Carter, you're like the master of this stuff. You always looked put together." But it was a strange compliment, but it landed right in the center of my chest. Me, Leo Carter, the master of invisibility, was being noticed for being put together for the first time. The uniform didn't feel like a costume of shame. It felt like something I was actually getting good at. And that feeling, as bizarre and unexpected as it was, felt a lot like pride. Our American history class was assigned a semester-long project, the Northbridge Chronicle, an exploration of the school's own past. We had to dig into the archives and find a story from a specific decade and present it to the class. Naturally, Mr. V.S. Davison paired me with Chloe. My stomach did a nervous flip-flop when he announced it, a reaction that was equal parts terror and elation. The Northbridge archives were housed in the basement of the oldest building on campus. It was a dusty, forgotten place that smelled of old paper and decaying glue. Rows of metal shelves were crammed with cardboard boxes filled with old yearbooks, student records, and forgotten school newspapers. The only light came from a few flickering fluorescent bulbs that cast long, spooky shadows. "Okay, so what decade are we thinking?" Chloe asked, her voice echoing in the stillness. She pulled a box marked 1990s off a high shelf, blowing a cloud of dust off the lid. "I don't know," I said, shrugging. "Maybe something more recent, like the 2010s. "Good idea, less dust." She grinned and moved down the aisle. We spent the better part of an hour sifting through old files. It was mostly boring stuff, budget reports, PTA meeting minutes, sports team rosters. I was starting to think our project was doomed to be about the rising cost of cafeteria tater tots. I pulled out a heavy overstuffed binder labeled Student Counseling and Disciplinary Records 2014 to 2015. It was probably a dead end, but I was out of ideas. I opened it on the large wooden table in the center of the room. The pages were filled with official-looking forms, detailing minor infractions like dress code violations and skipping class. And then I saw the name, Carter. My eyes snapped to it. It was a disciplinary report form, but it was attached to a thicker file. Alex Carter, grade 11. Whoa, I said mostly to myself. This kid has my last name. Chloe came over, peering over my shoulder. Alex Carter, she read. What did he do? They say. I scanned the first page. It says, repeated instances of targeted harassment. Bullying. I flipped the page. There were multiple reports, all filed by the same guidance counselor. The details were sparse, but grim. Alex was being targeted by a group of older students. The reasons cited were vague, behavior deemed non-conforming, artistic and sensitive nature, failure to engage in traditional masculine pursuits. Jeez, Chloe whispered, her voice soft. They bullied him for being quiet and liking art. We kept reading. The file painted a picture of a quiet, withdrawn 17-year-old boy who loved to draw and who, according to teacher notes, was exceptionally gentle and creative. He didn't play sports, he wasn't loud or aggressive, and for that, he was tormented. His drawings were torn up. He was shoved in the hallways, cruel. Homophobic slurs were written on his locker. My stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. It felt uncomfortably familiar. While I had never been bullied that severely, the idea of being targeted for not being manly enough hit way too close to home. We dug deeper into the box and found a corresponding counseling file. Inside were handwritten notes from his sessions. His counselor, the person he had been speaking to about the relentless bullying, was a younger, less severe-looking Dr. Thompson. My breath hitched. Chloe, look! She leaned in closer, her hair brushing against my arm. We read the notes together. Dr. Thompson had fought for Alex. She'd held meetings with the bullies and their parents. She had written multiple memos to the principal at the time, pleading for stronger intervention. And then we found it. Tucked into the back of the file was a formal proposal, written and signed by Meredith Thompson, head of student counseling. It was dated just a few months before the end of that school year. Chloe read it aloud, her voice barely a whisper. Proposal for a mandatory empathy and perspective program. She began. She wrote, in light of recent events, it is clear that our male student body suffers from a profound empathy deficit, particularly concerning alternative expressions of masculinity. I propose a radical, short-term social experiment, requiring all male students to adopt the female uniform for a period of 1 month. The goal is not humiliation, but to instill a visceral understanding of vulnerability, to deconstruct harmful gender stereotypes, and to force students to literally walk in another's shoes. Enamored. I stared at the words, my blood running cold. It was all there. 10 years ago. The exact same idea. It was rejected, I said, pointing to the big red denied stamp across the top of the page. The principal had scribbled a note. Dr. Hutz, Dr. Thompson, this is an absurd and potentially harmful idea. We will handle the situation through traditional disciplinary channels. A heavy silence settled over us. It was all starting to make a horrifying kind of sense. The uniform, the strict enforcement, Dr. Thompson's cryptic note about walking in someone else's skin. This wasn't a new idea. This was a ghost, a decade-old plan resurrected. But why now? The answer was in the last document in the file. It wasn't a school record, it was a newspaper clipping, folded into a neat, small square. It was from the local paper, dated August 2015, just before the start of the next school year. My heart sank as I read the headline. Northbridge student dies by suicide. Alex Carter, He had taken his own life during the summer break. Chloe let out a small, choked gasp. I felt like the air had been punched out of my lungs. He was just a kid. A quiet, artistic kid who was just like me. Only he didn't have a pleated skirt alliance to protect him. He was alone. I leaned back in my chair, the dusty air of the archive feeling thick and suffocating. This whole thing. This entire insane, humiliating, life-altering social experiment. It wasn't about us. Not really. It was about him. It was Dr. Thompson's terrible, delayed, radical attempt to make sure what happened to Alex Carter never happened again. And the fact that his last name was the same as mine sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold basement. It felt like destiny, like his story was a ghost story and I had just been cast as the lead. The news of our research spread like wildfire. Chloe and I had only told a few friends, but in a school as gossipy as Northbridge, a secret like that has the shelf life of a snowman in July. The story of Alex Carter. And Dr. Thompson's decade-old rejected proposal added a dark, tragic layer to the uniform debate. For some students, it fostered a grim understanding. For many parents, however, it was gasoline on an already raging fire. They saw it not as a tragic backstory, but as proof that Dr. Thompson was an unhinged ideologue who had been trying to force her radical agenda on their sons for years. The simmering anger boiled over. An emergency town hall meeting was called, hosted by the school board. It was held in the same auditorium where this whole nightmare had begun. But the atmosphere was 100 times more volatile. I didn't want to go. The last thing I wanted was to be in a room full of angry adults yelling about me and my friends. But Seth and Mike were going, and Chloe insisted it was important for students to be there, to show that this wasn't just about the parents. So I went. We sat in a small group near the side, trying to make ourselves as small as possible. It didn't work. Our navy skirts and pink tights made us stand out like neon signs in the sea of furious-looking adults. The meeting was chaos from the start. One after another, parents marched up to the microphone to vent their outrage. "This is psychological abuse," a woman in a business suit declared, her voice trembling with rage. "You are deliberately shaming our boys, making them targets for ridicule." "My son used to love school," another man shouted, jabbing a finger toward the stage where Dr. Thompson and the school board sat, their faces grim stone masks. "Now he pretends to be sick every morning. This is an embarrassment to our community." The air was thick with fury. It felt like a witch hunt. Dr. Thompson sat perfectly still through it all. Her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her. She didn't flinch, didn't argue. She just absorbed the hatred like a granite cliff absorbing the waves. The peak of the madness came when Kevin McLaren's father took the stage. Mr. Boisfier. Mr. McLaren was a big, intimidating man, a former college football player who ran a successful construction business. He looked like the kind of guy who had probably bullied kids like Alex Carter himself back in the day. He gripped the microphone, his knuckles white. "I'm a simple man," he began, his voice booming through the auditorium. "I believe boys should be boys. I believe in strength, in toughness. And what are you teaching them with this nonsense?" He waved a dismissive hand. "You're teaching them to be weak. You're emasculating them." His eyes scanned the crowd, and then they landed on me. He lifted his arm and pointed directly at me. At me. 100 heads swiveled in my direction. The spotlight I had feared for months was now real, and it was blinding. "Look at that boy right there," Mr. McLaren roared. "Just look at him hunched over, embarrassed to even be seen, humiliated. Is that what you want for your sons, to turn them into these pathetic creatures?" The world stopped. Every sound, every breath in the auditorium seemed to vanish. There was only the thunder of my own heart in my ears and the weight of hundreds of eyes on me. I felt my whole body start to tremble, a violent, uncontrollable shaking. The heat in my face was so intense, I thought I might actually combust. I wanted to disappear. I wanted the floor to open up and swallow me whole. I wanted to be anywhere else in the universe. I could feel Seth's hand on my shoulder, trying to ground me. I could hear Chloe whisper my name, her voice filled with concern. But they sounded a million miles away. All I could feel was the searing shame of being singled out, of being made into the poster child for this policy. I was the pathetic creature he was talking about. I wanted to run, but my feet, in their stupid, clunky Mary Janes, felt like they were nailed to the floor. I was trapped, paralyzed by humiliation. This was it. This was the absolute bottom. For a long moment, I just sat there, pinned by Mr. McLaren's accusation and the stares of the crowd. My mind was a whirlwind of panic. Don't look up, don't move. Just wait for it to be over. But then, something shifted. Through the roaring in my ears, I thought of Alex Carter. I thought of him sitting alone in the cafeteria, of having his drawings ripped up, of the cruel words on his locker. He had no one to stand up for him. Dr. Versada Thompson had tried, and they had shut her down. He had been made to feel like a pathetic creature until he believed it himself. A new feeling began to push through the fear. It was a hot, slow-burning anger, an anger at Mr. Cunnier, Mr. McLaren for his casual cruelty, an anger at the crowd for their easy judgment, an anger that they were doing the exact same thing to me that a previous generation had done to Alex. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't just sit there. I couldn't be invisible anymore. My body moved before my brain had fully caught up. I felt myself stand up. The trembling was still there, but now it felt less like fear and more like pure adrenaline. Seth grabbed my arm. "Leo, what are you doing?" he hissed. I didn't answer. I just started walking, down the aisle, toward the stage, toward the microphone that Mr. McLaren had just abandoned. Every step was an earthquake. The clack, clack, clack of my Mary Janes on the floor sounded like gunshots in the silent auditorium. I could feel every eye in the room following me. I reached the stage and walked up the 3 short steps. The microphone stood in the center, a lone metal tree in a desert of judgment. I gripped the stand, my knuckles turning white. I could see the whole crowd now, a sea of hostile, confused, and curious faces. My parents were out there somewhere. Chloe was there, her eyes wide. Dr. Thompson was looking at me, her expression unreadable. I opened my mouth, and for a second, no sound came out. My throat was sandpaper. I took a shaky breath and tried again. "When this started..." My voice was a reedy, trembling thing. It cracked. A few people snickered. I cleared my throat and leaned closer to the mic. "When this all started," I said, a little louder this time. I hated this uniform more than anything. I looked down at myself, at the navy skirt, the pink tights, my awkward shoes. I was so embarrassed, so ashamed. I didn't want to leave my house. I didn't want anyone to see me. "I agreed with a lot of you," I said, looking out at the parents. "I thought this was just a punishment, a humiliation." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. The snickering had stopped. People were listening. But a funny thing happened. After a few weeks of being stared at, and whispered about, and pointed at, you start to realize something. It's just clothes. It's just fabric. It has no power unless you give it power. "These things," I said, gesturing to my skirt. "Don't make me weak. Facing all of you right now, dressed like this. This is the hardest thing I've ever had to do. This doesn't feel weak. It feels terrifying, but it also feels strong." My voice was getting steadier, gaining confidence with every word. We have all these rules in our heads, rules we never even think about. We say it's normal for a girl to wear pants. My mom wears pants. Chloe wears jeans. Nobody cares, but the second a boy puts on a skirt, it's a disaster. It's a crisis. It's the end of the world. "Why?" I asked, my voice rising. "Who made that rule? And why are we all so afraid of breaking it?" A murmur went through the crowd. Some parents were nodding slowly. Others still looked furious. A group of girls in the student section, Chloe's friends among them, stood up and started a ripple of applause. It was small, but it was enough. It was fuel. Being forced to wear this, I continued, my voice ringing with a conviction I didn't know I had. It didn't make me less of a man. It didn't take anything away from me. But it gave me something. It gave me a tiny idea of what it might feel like to be judged for something you can't control. For something as simple as what you're wearing. It forced me to face my own fear. Not the fear of being laughed at. The fear of being different. I looked directly at Mr. McLaren, who was staring at me, his mouth slightly agape. You called me pathetic. Maybe I am, but I'm standing up here, in front of all of you. Wearing this skirt didn't make me lose my identity. It just forced me to figure out what it really was. The auditorium was quiet now, a deep, thoughtful quiet. The anger had dissipated, replaced by something else. Maybe not agreement, but at least, for the first time, a flicker of understanding. I let go of the microphone stand. My hands were shaking again, but for a different reason now. I turned and walked off the stage. My head held high. The applause started again. Louder this time. A wave of sound that washed over me, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen. My speech didn't magically solve everything, but it cracked the foundation of the opposition. It shifted the conversation from outrage to introspection. The town hall ended not with a resolution, but with a sense of weary confusion. The school board, caught between angry parents and a surprisingly articulate student body, did what committees do best: they compromised. A week later, a new memo was issued. The mandatory uniform policy was officially rescinded. Instead, a new, optional dress code was implemented. Male students could now choose, on a daily basis, between two official uniforms: the traditional Northbridge uniform of charcoal grey trousers and a blazer, or the empathy uniform of the navy pleated skirt, pink tights, and Mary Jane shoes. The first day of the new choice was one of the most interesting days of the school year. The air in the hallways was buzzing with a new kind of tension, the tension of decision. Who would wear what? Kevin McLaren and his entire football team clique were, unsurprisingly, the first to show up in pants. They walked with an exaggerated swagger, a performative masculinity, as if to wash away the memory of the past few months. They looked relieved, smug even, like prisoners who had just been set free. They were back to normal, and they made sure everyone knew it. Others followed suit. A large portion of the male student body reverted to trousers. Their relief palpable. The sea of pink legs that had defined our school for months had thinned out into small scattered islands. But not everyone switched back. Seth came to school in the skirt. Honestly, he told me by my locker. It's just more comfortable, and I'm used to it now. Pants feel weirdly restrictive. Mike showed up in the skirt too, but he had swapped out the regulation pink tights for a pair of black ones he'd bought over the weekend. Makes it look edgier, right? He said, striking a pose. It's a look. I'm sticking with it. Nate and a few others from our alliance also chose the skirt. It had, for them, become a part of their identity. And then there was me. I stood in my bedroom that morning for a full 20 minutes, staring at the two options hanging in my closet. The grey trousers represented safety, invisibility, a return to the boy I was before all this started. I could put them on and just disappear again. No more stares. No more whispers. The thought was incredibly tempting. It was an easy out, a release from the constant pressure of being on display. But then I looked at the skirt. It wasn't just a piece of fabric anymore. It was a symbol of everything that had happened: the initial horror, the quiet adaptation, the alliance with my friends, the terrifying moment on the stage. That skirt had forced me to become someone I never thought I could be. Someone braver. Someone who had a voice. To put on the pants felt like a betrayal of that person. It felt like retreating, like admitting that that McLaren had been right, that I had just been waiting for my chance to stop being pathetic. My hand hesitated for a moment. Then I reached into my closet and took out the skirt and a fresh pair of pink tights. The decision settled in my gut, with a surprising sense of rightness. It was no longer a mandate. It wasn't something Dr. Thompson was forcing on me. This time, it was my choice. I walked into school that day with my head held a little higher. The dynamic had changed completely. Before, we were all united in our forced compliance. Now, we were individuals making a statement. Wearing the skirt was no longer a sign of submission, it was an active declaration. It said, I am not afraid. This is a part of who I am now, and... The boys in pants mostly left us alone. The smug looks were still there, but they were tinged with a grudging respect. We had endured the same trial, but we had come to a different conclusion. We had been given a choice, and we had chosen the harder path. When I saw Chloe in the hall, she gave me a slow, approving smile. It wasn't about the clothes, not anymore. It was about the choice, and for the first time, I felt genuinely, completely in control. The uniform no longer defined me. I was defining it. With the pressure of the mandate gone, something inside me began to quietly unfold. The uniform was no longer a battle to be fought every morning. It was just a part of my life. A choice I was making, and with that sense of ownership came a new freedom to explore what it all meant for me. Leo Carter. The changes were gradual. Small shifts that added up over time. It started with my hair. I'd always kept it in that shaggy, non-committal style, long enough to hide behind. But now, I didn't feel like hiding as much. I let it grow out, past my ears, then down to my collar. I learned to tie it back in a small, low ponytail on days when it got in my way. It felt right. The longer hair seemed to balance the look of the uniform, to soften the angles of my face. My movements continued to evolve. The soft clack of my Mary Janes on the linoleum floors became a familiar rhythm. I learned to walk with a smoother, more fluid gait, not because I was trying to be girly, but because it was simply the most efficient and comfortable way to birth in the shoes and skirt. I stopped feeling clumsy and started feeling graceful. It was a word I never would have associated with myself before. There was a quiet confidence in moving with intention, a pleasure in the simple act of walking across a room without stumbling over my own feet. Then came the makeup. It happened by accident. One Saturday, I was studying with Chloe at her house. I had a massive angry-looking pimple on my chin, and I was complaining about it. "Hold still," she said, disappearing into her bathroom. She came back with a small tube and a little sponge. "This is concealer. It'll hide it." Before I could protest, she was gently dabbing the cool cream onto my skin. "There," she said, stepping back to admire her work. "See, all gone." I looked in the mirror. She was right. The red blotch had vanished. I felt a blush creep up my neck. "Thanks," I mumbled, feeling weirdly self-conscious. "Don't be so dramatic." She laughed. "It's just makeup. People use it to cover stuff up. No big deal." But it planted a seed. The next week, I bought my own tube of concealer. I started using it not just on pimples, but to even out the skin tone under my eyes. It was my secret. A tiny act of aesthetic control. It wasn't about looking like a girl. It was about presenting a better, more polished version of myself to the world. It felt good. My physical awareness, which had been forced on me by the uniform, was now something I was actively cultivating. I found myself appreciating sensations I'd never noticed before. The soft brush of the skirt against my legs when I spun around to talk to someone. The smooth, seamless feeling of the tights. I even started to notice fabrics and textures in a new way, appreciating the softness of a sweater or the crispness of a new shirt. This wasn't a journey toward a new gender identity. I never felt like a girl trapped in a boy's body. It was more like my definition of what a boy could be was expanding. I realized that I had been living in a very small, narrowly defined box of masculinity, and the uniform had kicked the walls down. I could be a boy who liked the feeling of a skirt swishing around his legs. I could be a boy who wore a little concealer. I could be a boy who appreciated grace and aesthetics. These things weren't female, they were human. They were just qualities I had been taught to reject because they fell on the wrong side of an arbitrary line. Now, I was realizing I could draw my own lines. The biggest change was internal. I started to see myself differently. The shy, invisible boy was still in there, but he wasn't in charge anymore. I was more confident, more observant, more attuned to myself and the world around me. I had been forced to walk in someone else's skin, and in doing so, I had discovered the true shape of my own. It was a shape that was more complex, more interesting, and infinitely more authentic than the one I had been hiding in before. My friendship with Chloe had become the anchor of my new life. She was the one person who had seen me from the beginning. Not as a joke or a project, but just as Leo. We spent more and more time together studying, grabbing pizza after school, just talking. With her, I never felt the need to explain myself. One afternoon, we were crammed into a small booth at our favorite coffee shop, supposedly working on a history paper. The place was warm, smelling of coffee beans and cinnamon, a cozy refuge from a chilly autumn day. I was wearing the uniform, as I did most days now, with a soft grey sweater over my white school shirt. I was explaining some point about the Louisiana Purchase, gesticulating with my hands, when I accidentally knocked my pen off the table. As I reached for it, the collar of my shirt got bunched up under my sweater. "Here," Chloe said softly. She leaned across the table, her face just inches from mine. The space between us suddenly felt charged, electric. I could see the little flecks of gold in her dark brown eyes. She smelled like vanilla and old books. Her fingers, warm and gentle, brushed against my neck as she carefully straightened my collar. It was a simple, friendly gesture, but it sent a jolt straight through me. My breath caught in my throat. I held perfectly still, my entire being focused on the feeling of her touch. When she was done, her hands lingered for a second on my shoulders. She didn't pull away. Her gaze drifted from my collar up to my face, to my eyes. "You look beautiful today, Leo," she whispered. The word hung in the air between us. Beautiful. It wasn't a word boys were supposed to be called. It was a word for girls, for sunsets, for art. But coming from her, in that quiet moment, it didn't feel wrong. It felt true. It felt like she was seeing all of me, the shy boy, the brave speaker, the guy in the skirt, and finding something worthy in the whole mixed-up combination. A slow heat spread through my chest. I didn't pull back. I didn't blush and look away like the old Leo would have. I just met her gaze. A small smile played on her lips. She reached out and lightly took my hand, which was resting on the table. Her thumb traced a slow circle on my palm. Then, her fingers trailed down my arm, over the sleeve of my sweater, until they reached the top of my tights, where the fabric disappeared under the hem of my skirt. She rested her hand there, on my thigh, her touch a warm pressure through the thin nylon. It was an incredibly intimate gesture, yet it felt completely natural. "I like this version of you," she said, her voice low and steady. "The one who isn't afraid." My heart was doing a wild, chaotic drum solo against my ribs. The whole world had shrunk to the space of that small table, to the warmth of her hand on my leg, to the look in her eyes. This was so far beyond a simple crush. This was something real and profound. She wasn't just attracted to me despite the uniform. She was attracted to the person the uniform had allowed me to become. Leaning forward, slowly, so she would have time to pull away if she wanted to, I closed the small gap between us. Her eyes fluttered shut. And then, I kissed her. It wasn't a dramatic, movie-style kiss. It was soft and gentle, and a little bit clumsy. But it was also perfect. It was the culmination of months of shared glances, whispered secrets, and quiet support. It was the feeling of finally being understood. When we pulled apart, the coffee shop was still there. The world hadn't ended. But for me, everything had changed. The boy who just wanted to be invisible was gone for good, and I didn't miss him at all. The annual Northbridge Fall Ball had always been an event I dreaded. It was a night of intense social pressure, a place where the popular kids shone, and the invisible kids like me tried to find a dark corner to melt into. In previous years, I wouldn't have even considered going. But this year was different. This year, Chloe asked me to go with her, and for the first time, I was actually excited. The question of what to wear was, for once, not a source of anxiety. It was a creative challenge. I wasn't going to wear a suit and tie. That felt like wearing a costume, like pretending to be someone I wasn't anymore. I was going to wear my uniform, but I was going to make it my own. I spent the week leading up to the dance planning. I found a slightly longer skirt online, one that fell just to my knees, made of a softer, flowing black fabric instead of the stiff navy polyester. I paired it with brand new sheer black tights that had a subtle, elegant shimmer to them. I polished my Mary Janes until they gleamed under my desk lamp. The final touch was my hair. It was long enough now that I could tie the top half back, letting the rest fall around my shoulders. It felt sophisticated. It felt like me. When I arrived at Chloe's house to pick her up, she opened the door and her jaw literally dropped. She was stunning in a simple, deep green dress that matched her eyes. "Leo," she breathed, her eyes taking in my whole outfit. Wow, just wow. I felt a grin spread across my face. "You too," I said, and I meant it. Walking into the school gym, which had been transformed with twinkling lights and gauzy streamers, was a surreal experience. Heads turned as we entered. I could feel the stares, but for the first time, they weren't hostile or mocking. They were looks of surprise, of curiosity, and in some cases, of genuine admiration. I saw Mike give me a thumbs up from across the room, where he was dancing with his date, his own skirt and jacket combo, looking effortlessly cool. Seth was there too, laughing with a group of friends, perfectly at ease in his standard issue uniform. We had made our corner of this world normal. Chloe took my hand, her fingers lacing with mine. "They're staring," she whispered, a hint of amusement in her voice. "Let them stare," I whispered back, feeling a surge of confidence I'd never known before. She smiled and pulled me toward the dance floor. A slow song was playing. I tentatively put my hands on her waist, and she looped her arms around my neck. We swayed to the music, moving as one in the center of the crowded floor. The soft fabric of my skirt brushed against her dress. The sheer tights felt smooth and slick as I shifted my weight. The gym lights spun around us, creating a dreamlike kaleidoscope of color. In that moment, everything else faded away. There was no school policy, no angry parents, no judgment. There was only the music, the warm lights, and the girl in my arms. I felt completely and utterly free. I wasn't a boy in a skirt. I was just Leo, dancing with Chloe. I was comfortable in my own skin, in my own clothes, in my own life. As the song ended, she leaned in and kissed me, right there in the middle of the dance floor. It was a sweet, confident kiss, and I could hear a few people around us clapping and whooping. I didn't feel embarrassed. I felt a profound sense of peace. The uniform hadn't changed me into someone else. It had simply cleared away all the rubble, all the fear and insecurity, so that the person I was meant to be could finally step into the light. And as I held Chloe close, under the spinning, sparkling lights of the fall ball, I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was finally home. From a shadowed alcove overlooking the gymnasium floor, Dr. Meredith Thompson stood perfectly still, watching the scene unfold. Her face, usually a mask of stern authority, was softer in the dim light. Her eyes weren't fixed on any one person, but on the entire vibrant, chaotic tapestry of the dance. She saw it all. She saw Kevin McLaren and his friends, clad in their suits and ties, laughing near the punch bowl, occasionally glancing over at the dance floor with expressions that were no longer purely hostile, but tinged with a reluctant confusion. They had their masculinity back. But the world had not snapped back to the way it was. The lines were blurrier now. She saw Mike, with his black tights and leather jacket, and Seth, in his simple school-issue skirt, dancing without a trace of self-consciousness. They weren't making a statement anymore. They were just living, existing in a space they had carved out for themselves. The bizarre had become mundane. And she saw Leo Carter, the quiet, slouching boy who had trembled on the town hall stage, now standing tall in the center of the dance floor. He was a different creature, entirely poised, confident, and utterly at ease with himself. She watched as he and Chloe Arden kissed. A moment of pure, unadulterated teenage joy. She saw the students around them, some in dresses, some in suits, some in skirts, clapping for them. There was no mockery, no outrage. There was only acceptance. The diversity that had been so violently resisted just a few months ago was now simply the backdrop of a school dance. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched Dr. Thompson's lips. It was not a smile of triumph, but of quiet, weary satisfaction. She thought of Alex Carter, of his beautiful, delicate drawings, and his haunted, frightened eyes. She thought of the proposal they had called absurd and harmful. They hadn't understood. They thought the goal was to punish, to humiliate. They didn't realize the goal was to break something open, to use a sledgehammer to crack the foundations of their certainty, to force a new perspective where one refused to grow naturally. It had been a brutal, risky, and painful experiment. But as she looked out at the kaleidoscope of students below, she knew it had worked. The wound had been cauterized. She turned away from the balcony, the sounds of the music and laughter fading behind her as she walked down the empty, echoing hallway. Her work here, for now, was done. Phase 1. She whispered to the silence. Her voice a low, determined murmur. Complete. It was an ending, but also a beginning. This forced experiment was just the first step. The real work was still to come, building a new program, one founded not on coercion, but on the voluntary understanding that these students now possessed. A program about empathy and breaking down stereotypes that would be woven into the very fabric of Northbridge Academy. Leo, dancing with Chloe under the sparkling lights, knew none of this. He wasn't aware of the grander plan or the invisible hand that had guided his entire year. All he knew was that he was happy. The future was an unknown territory, filled with new challenges and new questions about who he was and who he wanted to become. But he was no longer afraid of the questions. The cryptic note he'd received on that first terrible day finally made sense. Walking a mile in someone else's skin might save your life one day. It hadn't saved him from a car crash or a physical threat. It had saved him from a life of quiet desperation. It had saved him from the prison of his own invisibility. He had been forced to wear a uniform, but in the end, he had forged an identity, one that was stronger, truer, and entirely his own. And as he spun Chloe around under the lights, the skirt twirling around him, he felt, for the first time, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be,